On the morning of December 3, 1942, a reconnaissance flight from Henderson Field returned with photographs that at first seemed ordinary, just swaying palm trees. But for the Allied analysts, something was off. The shadows didn't match the trees, and the angles hinted at something unnatural. Under magnification, they spotted it, hidden beneath a carefully arranged lattice of cables, fronds, and camouflage netting was a man-made structure, nearly 6,000 feet long and 90% complete. If it was what they feared, the lives of the 58,000 American troops fighting on Guadalcanal were in serious danger. It was a concealed airfield. Japanese construction battalions had landed on Munda Point in late November 1942. Among the most skilled engineering crews in the world. Working only at night, they turned a coconut plantation into an airbase while American reconnaissance planes flew overhead, unaware of the transformation. Their method was clever. Each night they would pick a section of the grove, climb the palms, fasten steel cables between the crowns, and cut the trunks at the base. Suspended in the web of cables, the trees remained in place while bulldozers cleared coral beneath. By dawn, the canopy was lowered, perfectly restoring the illusion of untouched jungle. Native laborers scattered fresh fronds over disturbed ground, making the site invisible from 10,000 feet. For a week, American pilots flew over Munda and saw nothing but dense forest, while bombers photographed every inch of coastline without detecting the hidden runway. When the December 3 report suggested a concealed airfield, American officer William F. Bull Halsey immediately recognized the danger. Enemy fighters from Munda could escort bombers to Henderson Field and back, leaving Guadalcanal's troops under constant air threat. The next day, 9 B-17s from the 11th Bombardment Group took off at 6 a.m., each carrying 500-pound bombs. They easily located Munda. The fresh coral runway stood out against the jungle. At 20,000 feet, Bombardier Lieutenant James McCoy aligned the target in his bomb sight and released the load. 36 bombs hit in textbook fashion, throwing coral and steel matting into the air. McCoy reported direct hits across the runway. Certain it was destroyed, it wasn't. The next day's reconnaissance revealed fresh steel matting over the craters, the runway intact, and new camouflage covering aircraft shelters. Heavier raids followed. Dive bombers and torpedo planes replaced their torpedoes with massive bombs intended to cripple the runway. Pilots claimed the airfield was torn apart, fuel dumps burned for hours, and a hit on an ammunition cache sent flames 500 feet into the air. Yet the next reconnaissance flight showed the runway operational again, with enemy planes ready in their shelters. Through mid-December, the attacks became routine, but Japanese crews, reinforced by hundreds of Korean laborers, repaired the damage. Each night, stockpiled coral and hidden steel matting allowed them to fix craters within hours. Even a devastating Christmas Eve raid, in which 20 enemy planes were destroyed or damaged, failed to stop operations. By New Year's Eve, Japanese medium bombers were operating from Munda, despite 150 to 200 tons of bombs having been dropped in a single month. On December 30th, reports showed Munda had endured another 40 tons of bombs the previous day with no loss of operational capacity. Air raids alone were not working, so Halsey decided on a new tactic: naval gunfire. The plan called for a surface bombardment force to slip in at night, shell Munda with hundreds of rounds for an hour, and withdraw at full speed before Japanese aircraft could respond. This meant venturing deep into enemy-controlled waters, farther than any American surface force had gone since the start of the war. Rear Admiral Walden L. Ainsworth was assigned to lead Task Force Affirm, with 3 light cruisers Nashville, St. Louis, and Hellenian destroyers Fletcher and O'Bannon. 3 battleships and 4 destroyers under Rear Admiral Willis A. Lee would provide distant cover. The bombardment was timed to coincide with a major troop movement to Guadalcanal on January 4th. Serving as both a diversion and a shield. On board the Nashville, Ainsworth studied the charts with his staff. Navigating to Munda meant threading through coral reefs, narrow passages, and confined waters. His assessment noted 2 major challenges: entering undetected, or at least preventing the enemy from knowing their exact movement, and withdrawing beyond the reach of land-based aircraft by daylight. While still under friendly air cover, on January 2nd, aboard the Louisville, Ainsworth's plan was finalized. Each cruiser would fire for 10 minutes along a 3-mile track at 18 knots, with each ship using nearly 1,100 6-inch rounds. The destroyers would add to the bombardment with 10 rounds per gun per minute from their 5-inch batteries. Navigation in the pitch darkness would rely on radar and one critical guide, the submarine Greyback, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Edward Stephen, which would surface exactly 2 miles northwest of Bonatetta Point to serve as a moving lighthouse. The Greyback was already en route, still recovering from an unusual medical emergency. Days earlier, a sailor's appendix had ruptured while submerged, and the pharmacist's mate had performed surgery on the wardroom table using spoons from the galley and pliers from the engine room in place of surgical tools. For spotting, Lieutenant Commander Dennis Crowley arranged for radar-equipped PBY Black Cats to orbit over Munda. Unlike cruiser floatplanes, these could loiter for hours, relaying corrections. Crowley personally flew preliminary missions on January 2nd and 3rd, harassing Munda while committing its landmarks to memory. The conference ended with orders for captains to study recognition silhouettes and approach routes. No radio transmissions. Toward the shore, no blinker signals, complete darkness, and total surprise. Crowley later wrote that this was the first naval bombardment of shore installations using the Navy's most advanced radar for both navigation and fire control, and the first time surface ships, submarines, and aircraft were coordinated in a night bombardment. 5 ships were heading toward a base that had already withstood 200 tons of bombs. At 8 p.m. on January 4th, southwest of the Russell Islands, Task Force Affirm split from its covering force and turned northwest into enemy waters. In column formation, Nashville led, followed by St. Louis, Helena and the destroyers Fletcher and O'Bannon, racing at 26 knots toward Munda Point, 200 miles into Japanese territory. The night was pitch black, with overcast skies hiding the stars and rain squalls, cutting visibility to almost nothing, ideal for a stealth approach or a disastrous grounding on a reef. In Nashville's pilot house, Captain Spanigle studied the SG radar screen, its ghostly green outlines marking islands and reefs. The new radar was their lifeline, with sonar constantly pinging for underwater hazards. The navigator checked positions every few minutes, matching radar echoes to charted locations. At 11 p.m., each cruiser launched a floatplane. The launches required brief flashes of light, a dangerous risk in these waters. The SOC Seagulls carried flares for emergencies and were to orbit behind Renova Island, ready to warn of enemy ships. 30 minutes later, the Black Cats were already over Munda, dropping 500-pound bombs and distracting the defenders. Japanese searchlights swept the skies, unaware that a column of warships was approaching below. At 12:25 a.m., Nashville's radar detected the Greyback surfaced exactly as planned. The submarine sent a challenge signal, and Nashville replied. The checkpoint was perfect. The column slowed to 18 knots for the final approach. As they rounded Bonatetta Point, tension rose. The Tokyo Express ran these waters nightly, and a chance encounter could ruin everything. Then the destroyer Fletcher reported a large vessel straight ahead, 4,000 to 5,000 yards out. Multiple crew confirmed the sighting, but the SG radar showed nothing. The radar operator stared at his empty scope, shaking his fist in frustration. Fletcher turned sharply to port, training torpedo tubes on the target. Strangely, the vessel seemed to turn with them, always keeping the same relative angle, impossible behavior for a real ship. The commander ordered torpedoes held. At 12:42 a.m., Nashville opened fire. 15 6-inch guns lit up the sea, and suddenly the enemy vanished. It was a shadow. Fletcher's Phantom ship had been their own silhouette projected onto haze. By Nashville's gunfire, when Nashville stopped firing at 1:13 a.m. and St. Louis began its bombardment, the Phantom returned, and Nashville experienced the same illusion, firing at what they thought was a torpedo boat. Intelligence later revealed the Japanese had suffered identical confusion during their bombardment of Guadalcanal in October, chasing phantom ships that didn't exist. But on this dark night off Munda, with guns roaring and adrenaline high, the illusions felt dangerously real. Worse, the muzzle flashes had exposed task force firms' position to every Japanese observer within 20 miles, costing them the element of surprise.